Hello, I'm William Spots, and welcome to the second episode in my series about the history of the interiors of the White House. Today represents the real meat of the series, the art and artwork that make up the most beautiful rooms of the White House, the green room, blue room, and red room, but not before finishing the East room, as promised last time. Join us as we continue to investigate the beauty and majesty of the interiors of the White House. So here we are back in the East Room, where we were last time when Program 1 finished, and we were just finishing up the Grant decorative scheme. And so when Roosevelt came around, he decides that this is stupid, and he wants to have the inside of the house mirror the dignity and style of the exterior of the house. So he goes from this to this, Louis XVI Revival style. And this is really the most beautiful, once again, like the entrance hall. It's just the most regal, classically inspired decoration. The thing is that this design scheme is not original, and so it's not that it's not original to the White House, it's that it's not original at all. And here you can see a comparison graphic that I made that shows the Salon de Réception or Famille in the Château de Compiègne, which was decorated by, I believe, Napoleon III. And then on the right, you can see the White House as decorated by McKim, Mead, and White in 1902. And the comparisons and similarities are just immense. You can see that the mirror frames are almost exactly the same. The pilasters are almost exactly the same. Even the cornice is exactly the same. Even the fireplace, look at that fireplace on the right, in the picture on the left, is a red marble fireplace, and then we've got a red marble fireplace in the White House. And then the furniture is all Louis XVI Revival in both pictures. And so those benches you see on the right are Louis XVI Revival banquettes that are still in the East Room today. I mean, it's just a total copy and paste job. It's kind of funny to think that Roosevelt was sort of the pioneer of making the White House a museum and making it reflect the style and decorating ideas of previous administrations, and he's just gone along and copied and pasted from a French chateau. And so the last thing that is really similar, it's a copy, it's the exact copy in fact, are those entablatures you see where there are depictions of Aesop's fables. Here's a picture from the Salon de Musique on the right, and on the left is the picture of the White House. And so it's not that the chandeliers and everything else are inspired by the Château de Compiègne. I mean, they may say that in the books and articles that I read in preparation for this, but I mean, it's a copy. I look at it, it's just a difference in scale. There's nothing else. Here is perhaps the best picture of this entire program, simply because of the nature of its pixelation. This file is 10,000 by 8,000 plus pixels. It's ginormous. I hope you've turned your video on to 4K, by the way, because the entirety of this series is in 4K. But especially for this photograph, because as you can see, the pixelation is so high that it looks like you're looking into a window through the East Room, not at your computer at a picture of the East Room. The real purpose of this picture for us is so that it can show us the details of the plasterwork. Here you can see the sculptural group that sits over the door surrounds, and it's essentially two winged putti, or cupids, with the bottom half of their bodies replaced with acanthus leaves. Here's another view of the ceiling. This is the ceiling medallion. And you've got these festoons that go out, and then there are acanthus leaves closer to the center. And then on each side, diagonally, so on your upper left and your bottom right, there are these octagonal panels which depict scenes that are similar to the ones in the entablatures and overdoors we saw earlier. So altogether, it's very nice. And if we go back to this picture with the Salon de Musique here, you can see that the plasterwork is also rather inspired by the Château de Compiègne, and it's just been expanded in order to fit the scale of the chandeliers that are in the East Room. And then we get back to this picture where on the top you can see the vigorous nature of the plasterwork on the ceiling, where there's sort of wreaths of, I don't know what that is, fruit and flowers on the very edge. And so the most important artifacts in the room are in this picture. You can see those beautiful hard stone and gilt bronze candelabra that flank that plant on the mantle were bought by James Monroe. And then the really beautiful thing is the piano on the left. And that piano was a gift of Steinway and Sons to Roosevelt. It's just a work of art. Here you can see a model that was done for it. And it's just chock full of beautiful design that's very timeless. The supporters are these eagles. I mean, the whole thing is gilded. And then going around the piano case, there are stylized seals or coats of arms of the 13 colonies. And then in the piano lid, there's a wonderful painting of the 9 muses. If anything will inspire you to get better at the piano, it's sitting at a piece of art like this. And while the bench is different here in this picture to the original, the rest of it is almost exactly the same. The piano was stuck in the Smithsonian where it resides today, and I've seen pictures of it, and it hasn't been restored at all. It's just sort of rotting away in one of the rooms. It hasn't been regilded. The painting is fading. It's very sad. And so essentially this, along with a lot of other stuff, was swept away because when Truman became president, he looked at the White House and decides this thing is in dire need of restoration. And so he brings a group of congressmen, including future President Gerald Ford at the time, to the White House. And Truman shows them around and brings them to one corner of the room, in the East Room, and says, well, I mean, look at this. The ceiling at this point is falling 18 inches below what it should be. And so there's sagging in places, so many pipes for gas and then electricity and then indoor plumbing have been drilled that the architectural report stated that the house was standing up only as a matter of habit, not because there was any sort of real support going on. And so Truman decides that they need to overhaul the White House. And at the time, many people said, well, why don't we just demolish it and build a new White House? Why don't we build something that's modern? And why don't we hire a dreadful architect like Le Corbusier or I.M. Pei or one of those other pseudo-artistic idiots in order to build a modern quote-unquote masterpiece? And rightly so, Truman didn't listen to any of them and said, no, we have to build it exactly as it was before. And so Truman decreed that the exterior walls of the White House had to be saved, the stone walls, from before the fire, the original stone walls. And so when they wanted to bring a bulldozer in order to take out the rubble, here you can see that Truman refused to let them touch the stone or dismantle the stone in order to bring in the bulldozer. So they had to take something like a week and take apart the bulldozer one by one, screw by screw, rivet by rivet, and then pull it through the doorway, in parts, and then reassemble the entire thing inside the White House. I mean, this is how adamant Truman was, really to his credit, in saving the historic exterior of the White House. And so here you can see the East Room at the time, completely dismantled. Everything had to be structurally improved. You can see that even the floor is being taken apart. And the interesting part for me is you can see on the right that once everything is stripped down, the original, what looks like either Jackson's or Grant's or Pierce's palmettes that adorn the wall are still there. And so Truman basically restores the room. Here you can see a picture from the Kennedy administration, but he shortens the chandeliers, and the crowns of the chandeliers are changed. And so everything is sort of toned down a little. You can see that there's less furniture in the room. There's no plants except for that one in the center. And then everything is just sort of calmed down a little bit, unfortunately. And so we lose some of the most important architectural elements that were there beforehand. Here you can see what happened over the door. And so what before were those babies or those putti that were holding up the shield, now is this sort of rather boring U.S. seal that you'd see in a public building. And then now we get basically back to the modern day, where it's essentially the same as what the Trumans and Kennedys wanted for it. There are less decorations in this room than there are in, for example, the smaller parlors we're going to see later today, the red room, green room, blue room. So I'll give you a quick overview of the decorations that are here. Here's the end of the room at the left, where you can see a portrait of William McKinley by Harriet Anderson Stubbs Murphy. Say that 3 times fast. It was a woman, and painted more than 1,000 portraits, a very impressive feat, in her lifetime. She became so prominent that many generals, admirals, senators, and even U.S. presidents sat for her, multiple of them. Eventually, she discovered that using her husband's name would let her charge up to $4,000 per portrait, which is the modern equivalent of $125,000. Yikes. At some point, her husband, who was also a portraitist, realized how much better she was and quit painting. So essentially, she was signing portraits with his name, so he figured, why pollute the pool with my inferior works? Hilarious situation. He basically became her business agent, and so this picture has become famous because it's one of the only presidential portraits that was done by a woman. And then next to it, you can see the fireplace, which is red marble, except for the fact that it wasn't red marble for long. Originally, as we saw, it was red marble, but here is a close-up of the Kennedy scheme. And part of the Kennedy scheme was overpainting the marble fireplaces with scagliola. Here you can see it with the paint half stripped off, so that the marble looked white too. I don't understand Mrs. Kennedy's decorating sense in that she would get rid of these wonderful accent pieces and just sort of make them blend into the wall. So you can see they were overpainted, as I said, with scagliola to change the marble from red marble to white marble, but those have recently been uncovered. And then next to that is a portrait of Martha Washington by Andrews, famous portraitist. This was done about 100 years after the period it is supposed to depict. So that chair that you see that she's holding is actually inaccurate. That chair is like Gothic revival style, which was only popular during the middle to late 19th century. So it's somewhat anachronistic that this portraitist included that with a picture of Martha Washington, which was painted as a companion to this portrait, which you see over here, which is the Lansdowne portrait of George Washington. We've just passed, by the way, 2 of the mirrors. You can see that the tops of the mirrors have been changed. They went from being those scrolled type of things to these eagles during the either the Kennedy redecoration or the Truman reconstruction. And this portrait of George Washington is the foundational piece upon which the rest of the Whitehouse collection has been built. This portrait has been universally acclaimed as the best object in the Whitehouse collection, and I quite agree. Both the provenance, the symbolism, and the quality of the painting altogether render it an extremely valuable piece of American history. It was painted in, I believe, 1797 by Gilbert Stuart. So he paints Washington here as the president, the civilian. It was commissioned by the Earl of Shelburne, who was also the Prime Minister of England. He commissioned this portrait because Washington was so well known that he had garnered respect and admiration from people who had previously opposed him. And in this portrait, he is depicted, of course, in the grand manner, which essentially means the way in which people were depicted in portraiture, where they're surrounded by Roman and Greek elements that draws some sort of line or comparison between their actions and what happened in antiquity. Here he's dressed in civilian clothes. It's a black velvet suit, probably made of silk, and so are his stockings. He carries a dress sword, but this is not a military sword. Dress swords were carried by gentlemen of the time. It was sort of the walking cane of the 18th century. And he's specifically not depicted in military attire here because he wants to distance himself from the gaudy attire of the European monarchs at the time. And so Washington here, dressing in a simple black suit, is rejecting all of that and confirms this vision of Republican government and civilian control of the military. Here you can see he's surrounded by symbols of what he's done in his life. Below him, you can see that that table leg is actually a copy, or rather a more stylized copy, of the mace of the House of Representatives at the time. So it represents legislative power. You can see it's an eagle, and in one talon. It's grasping a bunch of arrows, just like the U.S. seal. And then below it, the rest of the table leg embodies a fasce, which is another symbol of the Republic, because all of the colonies are banding together into one form. Then you can see that there are two books beneath the table, which are leaning in such a way that you can read the titles. One of them says Constitution and Laws of the United States, and one of them says the American Revolution, so obviously alluding to his leadership both in the American Revolution and the forming of the Constitution, since he was president of the Constitutional Convention. Then there is, on top of the table, his black hat in the background. Then there is an inkwell, which has his coat of arms on it, but is also supported by these dogs. Dogs in Roman times were symbols of loyalty. And so Washington's loyalty to his principles and the country, the best interests of the country, are being shown rather well here, or at least very easily, since it's in silver, and so it's easy to see in the portrait. He is in an oratorical pose. This portrait was taken right after the Jay Treaty, which was slightly controversial, in which we made some peace with Britain, finally. And so he's in a pose that would imply he's about to give a speech to Congress. The chair behind him has a small rosette you can see at the top of the upholstered back, which is an American escutcheon surrounded by what looks like laurel or olive leaves, or a wreath, so it symbolizes victory. And then above him, in the top right of the portrait, we not only see the red curtain that appears in all 18th century grand manner portraits, Doric columns, very common, and then there is a rainbow, which you can see starts a little bit above his right arm, and then is mostly seen in the upper right-hand part of the picture, and this rainbow represents the burgeoning peace that is brought about by the Washington administration. I could go on and on and on about this picture, but I will probably have a video about it separately at some point, so that I can explain the full symbolism that is encapsulated in this painting. This painting actually was witness to a large part of Whitehouse history. It was placed in the White House by John Adams in 1800 because he thought that the White House needed a reminder of George Washington and what the country had stood for in the early years. And it stayed there until 1814 when, as we said in the last program, which if you haven't watched you really should, that the British burned down the White House in 1814. Dolly Madison and a slave, Paul Jennings, I believe was his name, cut it out of its frame. It was so heavy, rolled it up, and then took it out of the White House. And if it weren't for Dolly Madison, this portrait would have burned with the rest of the house. And so it returned at some point and has been sitting in the East Room ever since, except for a small amount of years where it was in other rooms, as we will see later. The one most interesting thing, for me at least, is in the bottom corner where I showed you those book titles. You can see it actually says United Sates, not United States. It's S-A-T-E-S. And that's how you can tell the difference between the copy and the original. The original is in the National Portrait Gallery. There are 70 copies that Stuart or his studio made, but the one in the White House says United States. Very interesting. And on the end, you can see a portrait of Theodore Roosevelt, the same one that we saw in the entrance room. This is the same one where he's grabbing that newel post you see on his right. And this portrait has a very interesting story. Apparently, when the first portrait of Roosevelt was painted, he hated it and thought he looked like, quote-unquote, a mewing cat. So he had it destroyed. And he hired John Singer Sargent to paint this portrait of him. They were milling around the White House, the story goes, trying to find a correct pose, and Roosevelt was very impatient. He was not a good sitter for portraits. He didn't like waiting. He was the type of man where he wanted to get things done all day. And so he starts arguing with Sargent about finding a pose, and Sargent doesn't think that anything is right. And so finally, Sargent tells him that he doesn't know what is required for a portraitist to make a good portrait, which is sort of an insult to the president, and the president whips around, grabs this newel post, and indignantly says, "Don't I?" And so apparently that was the moment where Sargent had found his pose. This isn't really true, at least we think it's not true, because there was no such newel post in the White House, but it is a good story, and he did love his portrait after it was painted, so everything was fine afterwards. But you kind of can imagine Roosevelt turning around, putting his hand on his hip, and in a very masculine way grabbing that newel post and replying to the painter, how dare you'd speak to the president this way. It sort of adds a little more character to the portrait when you know its story, or at least the supposed story. And so the last thing here are these light standards, which are very nice. And they have both neoclassical and Egyptian revival motifs in them. Remember that these things are much, much taller than a human being. Your head would probably only go up about halfway. These things are ginormous. They're maybe about 15 feet tall. It just shows you the whole scale of the room if we look back to this original photo. But anyway, now we move from the East Room through this doorway with one of those entablatures as overdoors that we saw into the Green Room. The Green Room is the first of the 3 small reception rooms planned by Hoban. If you look at this plan, this is Benjamin Henry Latrobe's, not Hoban's. Hoban had planned the White House as a formal sequence of reception rooms conforming to both British and French traditions. If we look at Benjamin Henry Latrobe's plan here, it reveals some of what Hoban had planned for the purpose of each room. Of course, the shape was dictated by the purpose. On the right, we have the common dining room, which is now the Green Room. In the middle, we have the drawing room, which is the Blue Room, which shows you that the Blue Room has actually never changed in purpose. While every other room has had some sort of other purpose at some point, the Blue Room has remained both the most formal and the longest standing reception room in the White House. And then on the left, we have the President's antechamber, which is now the Red Room. And then you can just see a little bit of, here's a better view, of what's on the very left, which is the library and cabinet, which is now part of the State Dining Room. This plan sort of shows us both the British and French influences that went into the rooms and their structure. If we think about staterooms, there are essentially 2 traditions that this building, the White House, draws upon. Number 1 is the French. The French were very particular, both in the 16th and 17th centuries, in how you would receive guests, how a nobleman would receive guests. Common men, of course, didn't have the money to plan all these elaborate rooms. In Louis XIV's, Louis XV's, and Louis XVI's designs, what you would do is essentially there would be a sequence of rooms where if you looked through the door, you could see all the doors were lined up and you could see all the way through the end. That's called an enfilade. Enfilade essentially means, as I said, there's a sequence of rooms and all of the doors line up. So if you shot a gun, essentially, from the first room, you would hit the wall in the last room, even if there were 8 rooms between you and the final one of the sequence. How far you were let in, meaning what room you were allowed into, farther and farther back, denoted your importance in the eyes of your host, the monarch or whatever nobleman you were being hosted by. This is how the French did it. There would be one line, essentially, where you would go all the way to the person's bedroom, most likely the monarch's bedroom, and then beyond that there was what was called a closet. It wasn't really a closet, it was just a very private room where only the most honored guests would be allowed to come. Now, if we look at the plan here, I realize this is a little long-winded, but you'll see why this all makes sense in a second. If you look at the plan here, you can see that Hoban has sort of mixed the British and French traditions. While the French tradition had one line going from the door of the house all the way through to this bedroom, or cabinet intérieur, the British had it a different way. They would have it so that there were 2 enfilades that converged upon the central room. And I'm sure you can see here that this is what Hoban has done. And what's interesting is that there's always an odd number of staterooms in the British tradition. And so that's what we see here, where there are the library and cabinet, president's antechamber, drawing room, common dining room, and public audience chamber, which is exactly 5. Here's a comparison graphic I made. On the right, you can see the floor plan of the White House, the same one we've been using, the Latrobe drawing of the Hoban plan. And then on the left, you can see a part of the floor plan of Leinster House, that ducal mansion we referenced in the first program. Everyone talks about how the exterior of Leinster House looks the same as the White House, but no one has actually looked at the interior. So I looked at the collection of the Irish Architectural Archive, which has a wonderful website, and I found this floor plan of Leinster House from the 18th century. You can see it doesn't really look like the White House. However, if you overlay the White House onto the plan, or at least a part of the plan, you'll see that the Blue Room, Green Room, and Red Room very much mirror this design on the left for a couple of reception rooms. No one actually talks about how the floor plan was influenced by Hoban. Whether or not Hoban actually had access to the floor plans is something I have no idea about. However, to say that these are just coincidences in their design, I think would be wrong. While today the green room serves as a venue for small teas and receptions, Hoban, as we said, originally planned it as a dining room, so it really hasn't moved much in the way of purpose. It's not specifically a dining room, but it is used as a dining room sometimes. When John Adams moved into the White House in 1800, you'll remember this is when the White House was not finished at all, he used it as a bedroom, a guest bedroom, which was interesting. Jefferson used it for the same purpose. It was originally decorated in the Georgian style, but after 1814 it was restored in the Federal style, and then the Empire style, which was popular in the first 2 decades of the 19th century. That was Monroe, of course, and he was the first one to put green in here, hanging a green silk on the walls. He used it for playing whist. It's a 4-person card game that was very, very popular among the aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially toward the late 18th century and the early 19th century. It's a very social card game because the person you're sitting across from, remember, you're sitting at a square card table, is your partner. So it's a great way for ladies and gentlemen to get to know each other in the court. It's dignified entertainment in a way. The room has stayed green ever since, so as the year 2018 passed, that would mean this room has been green for over 200 years. In the 1830s, when Jackson chose a new shade, the ladies of Washington said it was, quote, odious from the sallow look it imparts. So essentially they were criticizing him for his decorating ideas, which makes sense because Jackson was not in the type of position to make good decorating choices. He'd spent most of his life outside as a war hero, learning how to fight in the Revolutionary War at something like 13 years old, and then becoming a war hero in the War of 1812. In the 1840s, John Tyler used the room to display family portraits, and that's about all we get from the pre-illustration and photography era. So with that, we move on to the U.S. Magazine article that we saw last time from 1856. In this view, you can see 2 or 3 things that are of interest to us. Number 1 is there's a wild wallpaper, similar to the one we saw in the East Room last time. And then, aside from that, there is a ceiling painting, just to make sure that no surface went unadorned. So then there's this table in the back. You can see it between the windows. And miraculously, this table still exists. Here you can see a picture from, I believe, the 1960s. The earliest illustrations, you'll remember, are from this magazine. So this is the oldest identifiable object. There are also some other things in this picture that we'll get to later. But for now, we have to move on. Then what happens was the Pierce's decorating scheme lasted for about 4 years. And then when Lincoln was elected in 1860 and 1861, he decides to redecorate with his wife. This is some of the Lincoln scheme. We don't exactly know if this is Lincoln or Johnson, but we think it's from the Johnson administration. So this would be between 1860 and 1870, or 1868 actually. The decorative scheme you can see has changed somewhat, but not really. The biggest change here is the fact that the wallpaper is different and the chairs have slipcovers on them. If we remember from the last program, the chairs having slipcovers was a feature of the Johnson administration since he thought that the furniture was so ugly that it had been, used for 40 years or whatever, and it was ripped in places, that he thought putting slipcovers would sort of help heal the White House's reputation. There's also this statue you can see. Here's a colorized stereograph. This statue is one of the only things I could actually date. Here it is. We do know that it has existed since at least 1870. I think it's a little bit before that, since these pictures are pre-Grant, and Grant's presidency took up most of the 1870s, so this would be about 1865 to 1870. It is a very nice bronze, but the finish is rather decayed, and so it's got a sort of patinated look to it. Then we also get here to the other side of the room, where you can see perhaps the best piece of art that's ever stood in the green room, in my opinion, which is this huge life-size equestrian portrait of President Grant. At this point, he's painted as a general. waving his hat or saluting to the oncoming troops or the troops he's reviewing that are presumably in the place of the viewer. I could not find anything from this portrait. I looked it up everywhere. I read books. I cannot tell you where this portrait comes from, where it was painted, what happened to it today. There seems to be absolutely no record of its existence, which is fascinating, since it's such a monumental piece of presidential artwork. I guess this is pre-presidential artwork. But this suggests that this picture was taken sometime before Grant's presidency. I don't think Grant was vain enough to have put a ginormous portrait, that's probably 2 times the height of a human, in his own green room or in his own White House. So I think it's safe to assume that this is either from the Lincoln presidency or the Johnson presidency. However, since Johnson was a Democrat, it's probably from the Lincoln years. This room actually has some real significance for the Lincolns regarding their tenure here during the 1860s. Willie Lincoln, the president's son, died here in February of 1862, and Mary Todd never re-entered the green room ever again during his presidency. So anyway, this decorative scheme stayed for a while, and by a while I mean basically 10 years. And so when Garfield became president, we talked about this last time, his wife, Lucretia, had huge decorating schemes, but unfortunately he died after being assassinated in 1881. So after being in office for only a short amount of months, his wife had to vacate the White House. So she actually did get a few things that she wanted. This is circa 1885. Here you can see it with some different furniture and different wallpaper. You'll remember that chair you see in the foreground actually looks like the chair in the Martha Washington portrait we saw in the East Room, which is kind of interesting. You can see the curtains are basically the same. They're these sort of drawn up segments with no curtain helmet. There's the same mirrors, table, and fireplace. The Pierce table is the same as the Pierce one. The mirror is also from the Pierce administration, and so is the fireplace, that marble fireplace we saw earlier. As we said, there are various pieces of Victorian furniture. There's some Chesterfield chairs and other odd pieces. Here's another view of the room where you just get an idea of what's going on. You can see that there is some Asian art that's made its way into the room, which is a little bit of foreshadowing, as we'll see later. Here's a colorized stereograph of the other side of the room. And the best part of this stereograph is the portrait of Lucy Webb Hayes, who was President Hayes's wife. She was also known as Lemonade Lucy. This portrait is by Daniel Huntington. It's one of my favorites. That red gown in the classical setting is just so regal, and yet so down to earth. She's not wearing anything with embroidery or very expensive work. It's just a nice dress that covers everything and still manages to be dignified. It was paid for by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, so I guess the WCTU. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? She was actually the first lady to have a college degree. Quite progressive. Her father and mother actually inherited slaves, but freed them instead of selling them, which plunged them into deep, deep poverty. So from the very beginnings, her family had a great sense of moral righteousness. Because they freed all of these slaves and did not sell them upon inheriting them, her mother had to start taking in washing to earn money. So they really traded a good life for a clear conscience. Very, very admirable. Then she invited African Americans to perform at the White House for the first time. She wrote and read extensively on topics of national importance such as religion and social issues. She also supported the suffrage movement. She met Rutherford B. Hayes at Wesleyan University, the now famous Wesleyan, and they were married in 1852 after a lengthy courtship. She helped soldiers during the Civil War as a nurse and chaplain. Her resume just goes on and on. She started an orphanage and fought for more school funding across the board. Because there was no money to redecorate the White House at the time, she got old pieces of furniture from the attics to hide holes in the carpet and curtains. So you can see the picture on the left is a picture of a colorized illustration from a guidebook that I found in the Library of Congress. As I said, she would place these tables and whatnot in such a way that it would cover the holes in the floor and the curtains. It had nothing to do with a good decorating sense, which is certainly an interesting way to go about decorating the nation's home. She also included staff in the White House celebrations. She oversaw the installation of running water. Overall, an amazing person. Truly a model first lady. So this scheme did not last for long, which, as I said, this is going to happen a lot, so you'll get used to me saying it. And then here's a picture of what's either the original frame or a changed frame. I don't know which one came first. It's a very, very heavy frame, both physically and in a decorating way. So then we get into a decorative scheme that is a little bit different. Here you can see there's a new table in the room. This is courtesy of Julia Grant. So the Grants redecorated a little bit, as you saw with the East Room, and several things were dispersed throughout the rest of the White House. Because of Julia Grant, she wanted to redecorate some things. This table is actually a real treasure. If you look at it here, it's made by Herder Brothers in 1875. This is when she redecorated the Red Room. It's rosewood with satinwood, holly, and boxwood inlays in marquetry, as you can see. It has this festoon as a drawer. It's got vigorous carving with lots of Greek and Roman motifs. It's got lions' heads as supporters and paws. It's got the label in the back, as you can see. There's also a C scroll, if you see this close-up on the left. If you look back to the bottom of the table, you can see that the center of the X stretchers is a kylix. For those of you who don't know, a kylix is an ancient Greek wine cup. So it's part and parcel of the rest of the scheme where Greek and Roman allusions are included in this table. It does look very 19th century, but it actually is much more a copy of an ancient Roman and Greek table than it is a 19th century thing. So it is 19th century in that it's a revival, but every single element copies previous Roman and Greek decorating schemes. Here you can see that the lions actually match this table that I found that was found at Pompeii, that site where the volcano saved everything, essentially, while it killed everyone near Naples in Italy. The table has the same type of lion's head and then that protruding chest and then a leg and then a paw at the end. Here's another picture of a table. This picture I took at the Getty Villa in Los Angeles. This is a copy of an ancient Roman table, and it's also got the same type of thing. It's got a rectangular top, and then it uses a lion and then a protruding chest and a large paw holding the bottom. So then once again, the decoration changes. And this time, it's the Harrisons that get their turn to completely overhaul the green room. And this is what they came up with. It's actually quite elegant compared to the previous schemes, in my opinion. Anyway, so the Harrisons always had wonderful taste. And you can see here that they have completely refurbished the room with new furniture, which is in a comfortable, richly upholstered lounge style. So you can tell this is more of an informal room. That circular piece of furniture you see in the center is called a tete-a-tete. It's essentially a piece of furniture that seats 2 or 3 people for a private conversation. Tete-a-tete means head-to-head in French, but usually refers to a one-on-one conversation. In French, a 2-person type of this piece of furniture is called a confidant, and a 3-person one is called an indiscreet. It's hilarious. In the English-speaking world, they're known as conversation chairs, or more interestingly, gossip chairs. Because they're so close to each other, they breed gossip. Then obviously, there's the piano with the fringed velvet cover, which we saw earlier. Just beautiful. You can see Lucy Webb Hayes is still there. By the way, I didn't actually tell you why her name was Lemonade Lucy. She didn't actually allow alcohol in the White House. So she was called Lemonade Lucy because of the alternative non-alcoholic beverages that she provided to White House guests. There's also an electrified chandelier, finally. You'll remember that the Harrisons are the ones who actually promoted electrification in the White House and got it done. This chandelier is a composition of beautiful bronze work. It's got these engraved globes. This is a very high definition photograph. If you're not in 4K right now, turn it on because you're missing something. This chandelier has not only, as I said, beautiful workmanship that goes into the actual bronze work, but the engraved globes, which were certainly probably done by hand, and then the bulbs that you see, the exposed bulbs in between those globes, were added by the Harrison. So this chandelier was there, as you saw in previous pictures. It was just electrified by them. It's very beautiful. The most striking thing about this redecoration is the new paintwork on the walls, which is probably the first thing you noticed, aside from the new carpet. Or it looks like bare wood, actually. I don't know. So this paintwork is a Rococo revival scheme with swirls and then these compartmented designs. The frame surrounds trompe-l'oeil silk. Trompe-l'oeil, for those who don't know, means trick of the eye in French. And so you can see that in those brackets, or these frames rather, above the doors and then in panels elsewhere, there has been paintwork done to make it look like silk paneling, which was a common decorative technique at the time for people who didn't want full walls with silk on them. So it's not only got this beautiful Rococo style seashells and curves and things, it's also got the trompe-l'oeil trick of the eye element to it, which I kind of like. Here's an original design for the ceiling. You can see from that photo that we were looking at with the chandelier, you can just catch a glimpse of it. And you can also see that the chandelier picture provides a better view of what's going on with this, as I said, optical illusion, where it looks like there's silk in between those frames. So anyway, we get back to this design, and you can see it's also a very beautiful, faithful reproduction of Rococo schemes. It's got musical instruments, as you can see, and then it's also got a characteristically asymmetrical design. This is what Rococo was known for. Just a nice design altogether. Here's another view of the room where you can see the fireplace. It gives a vision of the different globes. You can see if we look back to this picture, the globes have a circular, or rather a non-frilly end on the top, and then over here the globes have been changed where they now have this, I don't know, funnel bowl type thing on the top. So that's a little different. And then you can see that, as with last time, these plants are slowly cropping up everywhere. That's how we know we're on the verge of a change, right? This is sort of our signal now for when the 1800 schemes get too crazy. So anyway, this scheme lasted for about 9 years, and then McKinley didn't really do anything, and so Roosevelt once again comes along and decides that this is too much. Here's another view, and that he doesn't like it at all, and he wants to change it. So he goes from this to this. Always beautiful, Roosevelt. I mean, round of applause always. This is circa 1901. This is a photograph that was actually restored by Click Americana. I asked them if I could use these in my documentary, and they said, sure, go ahead. They were very gracious, and I'm very grateful to them. They did an excellent job, and if you go look this picture up on Wikimedia Commons or the elsewhere, it just does not compare. This is the best, I think the only restoration, but even so, it's just the best version of this photograph that's out there. It has high resolution, and the colors have been faithfully restored. So kudos to Click Americana. You should go check out their website. Roosevelt hired A.H. Davenport of Boston, very swanky decorating firm, to redecorate the green room. They were primarily furniture manufacturers in the colonial revival style. So this is mimicking the late 18th century, early 19th century styles in the United States. The walls were dark green velour. So this is a velvety-like, very textured type of silk, I believe. If you would touch it, it would feel something like velvet. The chairs are, of course, somewhat colonial, and they have what's called tapestry upholstery. Tapestry upholstery is exactly what it sounds like, where they make the upholstery look like it's pieces of cut-up tapestry, which is an interesting thing. I don't really like it. I think it's too much. It reminds me of the furniture in the Golden Girls episodes, but I don't know. I guess it's the statement piece of this room. Then we have a reinstalled Monroe fireplace. You can see here, these are two close-ups. These are pictures taken 40 years afterward, but it's the same fireplace. These are in the Empire style. So, very characteristic of Monroe's decorating preferences. They've got these caryatids who are holding up, I guess rather calmly, the mantle on the fireplace with these small little pillows. It's sort of interesting how they're so relaxed. And then below it, they've got their robes, which are barely covering anything. And then below that is just very common Empire decoration. But the real star of this room, as you can see in that corner, are the Asian bits of art that we will get to right now. Chinese porcelain, where as soon as they discover the European market, they adopt certain European styles and work it into their traditional motifs. This is unfortunately part of what happens when demand comes in and opportunistic businessmen don't care about the preservation of the craft. So while there are specific makers, I couldn't find out who made this one, but there are specific makers who continue the quality throughout this sort of craze of industrialization and mass production. But there are, as I said, opportunistic businessmen who take matters into their own hands and start producing extremely cheap vases. This, in turn, significantly decreased demand in the 1880s, making it strange that these pieces were bought in 1883. These, unlike the lower quality examples that dominated the market at the time, are exquisite in their detail, as you can see, and overall composition. Bird and flower decoration with genre scenes of entertainment at court are very common here. So you can see the borders are full of flowers, birds, and then the central bits are, as I said, genre scenes of the court. So they've been in the green room since about 1884, 1885. And you can see on the right that wooden stand. Those were very popular at the time. It's just a wonderful piece. But anyway, it's just a fantastic piece of porcelain. I'm sorry I couldn't get a larger picture of it, pixel-wise. But as you can see, it's just the most beautiful piece of Asian art within all its detail. So then we look back to this picture, and we see that in the back, there's this other Japanese treasure, which is this very small desk. It's known as a chigai dana. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but what it means basically is that it's a compartmented shelf as well as a desk. So sometimes if you look up chigai dana, chigai-dana, you will find sometimes it refers to shelves, sometimes it refers to wall features that let you sit down. It's a very elastic term as far as I can tell. But continuing this theme of exquisite Japanese objet d'art, here is the chigai dana. It's completely covered in lacquer work. Lacquer has a very, very deep history in Japan. It started in about 7,000 BC, so roughly 9,000 years ago, if not longer. What they would do is here's a couple of manuscripts I found. They would use the sumac tree. Yes, the same sumac that Middle Easterners use in their food. It's called the Japanese lacquer tree, except sumac is very poisonous if you don't dry it out. So remember, in this form, it's not like people can be chewing the bark and nothing will happen. They would collect the sap, as you can see. Table is thought to have been a gift to the President Pierce in 1835 from Commodore Perry. So it's very likely that he brought it back from Japan in order to give it to the president. We see this, and as I said, all of the gold that you see is at least has some gold in it. But remember, this is a very small desk, so it can't really be used, at least by in a European or American sense. So if we look at this other photo, you can see that there is actually another beautiful piece of Japanese art sitting in the green room. What a treat. And so if we zoom in, as we just did, you'll see that it's this other type of desk. It's a desk that you use when you are sitting on the floor, which is a big part of Japanese culture, both now and a long time ago. This is even more superb if you look at the lacquerware. It's got different layering techniques. It's got birds and various types of foliage. The bird looks like a pheasant or a peacock, which were both somewhat popular when constructing these pieces. The leaves that you can see look like sycamore, poplar, or maple from that family, and the gilding is the yellow. So all of this gold and the lacquer makes it extremely, extremely valuable. It's unfortunate that they're not in the staterooms today. These two objects reside in the upper floors of the White House in a dressing room sort of tucked away. It's very sad. But it must be said, these are exquisite, beautiful works of art that Roosevelt has quite rightly placed at center stage in his newly constructed green room. So this scheme has basically stayed the same without the furniture. So that new chandelier is still in the White House somewhere. And those portraits are all of ex-presidents or former presidents. So you can see Roosevelt is really trying to bring a sense of history to the house. It's very admirable. Once again, hitting a home run with these redecorations, at least as far as I'm concerned. So this scheme stayed. And then between 1910 and 1948, there were a couple of changes, or rather the 1920s. The Coolidges replaced the furniture with real pieces from the federal period. Grace Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge's wife, also the woman who had a raccoon named Rebecca as a pet, she really spearheaded this effort to bring real historical furniture back to the White House, not just to have these reproductions that are kind of cheaply made. So she brought back some real federal period pieces to complement the Roosevelt scheme. Then there is this rug. You can see a picture of it here. This is the Coolidge rug, where it has some various 18th and 19th century, early 19th century motifs, but it features a seal, as you can see, and it's just it fits very well. It's really nice. And the room basically stayed the same from 1909, when Roosevelt left, to the Truman reconstruction in 1948, as we mentioned earlier while we were in the East Room. So the reconstruction occurs, as you can see, and Truman decides to go to B. Altman and various other department stores to redecorate the White House. I mean, it's unthinkable to someone who cares about history that the president would run off to a department store to redecorate. Truman wasn't exactly known as a man of great culture, except for the fact that he loved classical music, but it's very surprising. If you look on the right, it actually somewhat works. The wallpaper is a beautiful green, complemented by these very nice curtains with two swags and these floating tassels. And then there's the Coolidge rug, or at least a reproduction somewhat. It looks similar, but the seal is different. So I think it's a reweaving of the original. Architect Lorenzo Winslow directed this design of the reconstruction of the interior for Truman. Winslow kept the Monroe mantle and then added these silk wall coverings and restored Hoban's original design for the cornice, which is very simple, as you can see. So then the Kennedys come along, and the Kennedys have their own ideas. Mrs. Kennedy was really the person who actually formalized the White House's position as a museum, where they filed all sorts of paperwork with Congress. Congress declared everything in the White House inalienable property of the White House. It was she who started the White House Historical Association, a wonderful organization. So basically, Jacqueline Kennedy gets all these things started, and here you can see they've basically kept the Truman scheme the same, except for the curtains and the furniture. The furniture has this very weird white upholstery. I don't know what the point is. I don't really like it. When Jacqueline Kennedy was redecorating this room, her advisor, Mr. DuPont, had the Truman wall hangings cut up and fashioned into curtains. This was because at the start of the project they didn't have any money. They had a very small budget. So while these silk hangings are actually different, let's go back. You can see it's a similar pattern, but they've been cut up and made into these curtains. It's very strange. I don't know what to say. But the real beautiful part of this room is what you see on the mantle, which is this gilt bronze clock of Hannibal. Hannibal was an ancient Carthaginian general who lived from roughly 247 BC to around 182 BC. He was alive during the period associated with the Roman Republic, although he hated Rome. Famous for his military tactics, Hannibal's entire life was spent fighting the Roman Republic. There's really no other period of Hannibal's career. He pledged to his father that he'd never be a friend of Rome. His father was a great influence on him, and spent his entire life fighting for the destruction of Rome. His father was also a general who fought in the First Punic War, so you can see that's where he got it from. And Hannibal was the one who famously used elephants whilst crossing the Alps in order to invade Italy. Wow, right? How do you get an elephant to cross the Alps? I have no idea. He was always one for planning. He was always examining the weaknesses of both his and his opponent's armies. The Romans were so afraid of him and his military prowess that they never confronted him. Instead, they chose to agitate him through these small attacks, basically a type of early guerrilla warfare. He occupied a lot of southern Italy for more than a decade, and he is represented in this clock made in 1817 by Denier and Martin. Multiple Hannibal clocks were made, but no two are the same. You can see here that he's actually enjoying some onion rings, or mini donuts, depends on what you want. That's what my family said when I showed them these photographs. But he's just sneaking a little bit at a buffet. No, what he's doing is he's celebrating the victory over the Romans by counting the rings of the Roman nobility that he's killed at the Battle of Cannae. That's why it says Con from France below the clock face. These details that you see, these pictures that are close-ups, are not of the clock in the White House. They're a very, very, very similar one made by the same people at the same time. So it's all the same. It's just I had to use these so that you could see what words there are. So anyway, the Battle of Cannae is the one that's there. And then the rings that he's counting, you can see back at the White House clock here. Roman senators were famous for wearing these rings. It was a mark of their social class. And so Hannibal's statement here is basically that he's killed so many Romans that he doesn't even need to count the bodies. He's just collected the rings of the Roman senators. And you can see that bowl of rings is actually very large. So the whole statement is that Hannibal is such a victor that that just the amount of rings he's collected alone from these dead Roman senators shows his military prowess. It's a very masculine and uncompromising portrait of victory. And then it's flanked by these gilt-bronze amphorae. So then we move on, where the room has this permanent federal style. Here's another view. And what we can see from this end of the room is this fascinating portrait of Benjamin Franklin, painted by David Martin in 1767. It was commissioned by a Scotsman, Robert Alexander. While Franklin was in London representing the U.S., he resolved a property dispute between Alexander and the other man. These two men didn't know what to do, so they went to this famous American for advice and swore to respect his judgment. Franklin chose Alexander in the dispute, and so in response, Alexander commissioned this portrait and gave it to Franklin to thank him. The reading material that he's holding is actually one of Alexander's property deeds, so it alludes to the dispute that was going on at the time. The other reading material is evidence that this great sage is using wisdom in making his wise decision. This is also called the thumb portrait of Benjamin Franklin because the thumb on his chin is a very easy sign that he's a thinker, he's a philosopher. And this is supported by this bust of Isaac Newton on his left, which is sort of staring him down. It's an allusion to the principle of reason, of course. And the differences between Newton and Franklin are similar, but in their personal lives it was totally different because Newton died a virgin and Benjamin Franklin was someone who, let's say, had his share of fun while ambassador to France. The whole thing is basically complimenting Franklin on his decision-making. It's a very beautiful portrait, and Franklin liked it so much that he had Martin paint a copy of it for his house in Philadelphia. So then we move on to Nixon's decorating decisions, specifically Pat Nixon. here she is showing off the newly decorated green room, and you can see it looks basically like how it does today. She was involved in preservation efforts on behalf of the White House, which included substantial historic furniture acquisitions between 1969 and 1974. So she decides that she wants to buy better furniture, thankfully, and so she characterizes, or rather comes up with an idea that Duncan Phyfe, who was this very, very famous cabinet maker in the early 19th century in New York, will be the main attraction of this room. So she buys sophisticated furniture that's attributed to him, including a Sheraton secretary desk with 2 pedestal pier tables, which were acquired at this time. So as you can see, now we have the same curtain frames, the beautiful, beautiful curtains, I think the best ones so far, that are now still in the room. And then you can see here, there are some other views where there's a girandole mirror on top of the mantle. And then in the back of the room, you can see that Benjamin Franklin's still here. He's just been moved over a little bit. And then here you can see a close-up of the finials on the curtain frames. It's an eagle holding an American escutcheon. And then here we have 2 views from the Clinton administration, where you can see it's basically the same, but they've put a new chandelier in that sort of looks like that chandelier we saw that Roosevelt had put in. So where Benjamin Franklin was, he's now been returned to the mantle. And then on the left, we have essentially the same composition with a couple of new additions. And then we get back to the modern day. So here we are. As you can see, it's exactly the same as it was. Well, not exactly, but pretty much the same as it was before. So we have that same chandelier that the Clintons put in. We have federal furniture in general, which is unremarkable and simple. I don't really like it. And then over there we have Andrew Jackson by Ralph E.W. Earl, who was trained by his father, Ralph Earl. He studied with John Trumbull for a year, Trumbull, the famous American artist. He also studied with Benjamin West in London. Wow, I mean, who studies with 2 masters? I don't know. He became friends with Jackson in 1817 and lived with him at the Hermitage, which is his estate in Tennessee, which you can still see today. It's very beautiful. Ralph Earl was caricatured as the court painter of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, because of his actions during his presidency, the common critique was that he was acting like a king. And so the fact that he had this great friend who was constantly painting these grand portraits of him, of course, made the press come up with this title for him, that he was his court painter. Nevertheless, it is a beautiful picture. And then in the middle, you can see there's this painting, Sand Dunes at Sunset, by Henry Ossawa Tanner, who was the first African-American to be represented in the White House collection. Very interesting. It's a beautiful painting of, as I said, Atlantic City, these sand dunes with the plants protruding. Very nice. It was painted in 1885. And then below it we have Independence Hall by Ferdinand Reichardt from 1858. And it depicts, here's a close-up, it depicts a celebration, I believe, of Independence Day, July 4th, in front of the place where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed. This was a gift to the White House during the Kennedy era. And then over here, you can see that we've got William Henry Harrison, who was only president for 31 days because he caught a cold at his inauguration and died, probably because of his extremely long inauguration speech. And then surrounding it are other poor excuses for art, where there are modern, I don't know what to call them. It's got no composition, it doesn't fit at all. So much for historic interiors. And then there's this beautiful picture of James Polk, as you can see on the right. And then over here, we've got back to the main part of the room with the fireplace. We've got Benjamin Franklin there. And then we have this beautiful portrait of Benjamin Harrison by Eastman Johnson. And that's it for the green room. And so now we move on to the blue room. The history of the blue room is a lot less complicated, so don't worry, it's going to be a lot easier to get through this, and I think a lot more fun. The green room is just full of drudgery, where every single year there's a different thing. The blue room has been a lot less toyed around with, so this is going to be a lot more light and fun. prior to the illustration and photograph era, it was known as the elliptical saloon, which is, I guess, pretty descriptive. It was actually originally planned as an octagon, but they had to cut corners. No, that's not true. That's just a joke I've been waiting to use on the channel for about a year. The first scheme, you'll remember, that we talked about in the first program was that the Madisons had these classical revival Klismos chairs everywhere, and then I showed you that mantle. Not really much detail, but it's sort of been in the classical revival style for a while. Now it's in the French Empire style. Van Buren is the one who made it blue in 1837, and it's been blue ever since with some slight additions and things. Because this is a saloon, I looked at some other saloons in other great houses. It seems that saloons don't often have a lot of paintings. There are other saloons in other houses and that also have a history of more architectural types of decoration. So let's get right into it. Here's the US Magazine drawing of the Blue Room, and you can see right away it's dominated by the Pierce geometric ceiling frescoes. And once again, US Magazine hits it right out of the ballpark with this drawing. I kind of like how it's this oval drawing of an oval room, or rather semicircular. It's very interesting. It gives you a good idea of the curve of the room on this two-dimensional surface. Once again, it's got this wild wallpaper that looks similar to the one in the green room that we saw earlier. There's also the fireplace, if you look over here on the left, that mirrors the one in the blue room, in the green room. And this one stayed for, as we said, just a few years. It's sort of got a jumble of different objects. On the right, we have what looks like a French Empire pier table with then something else of a pier mirror on top. And then we have various elements of other sets of furniture. It's kind of a hodgepodge, and as I said, no paintings. So then the Lincolns come along and they decorate it like this. So you can see it's still got the Pierce wallpaper, but this is a colorized illustration, so we can finally see what it looks like to be in it. So this is a reception that the Lincolns had for various people. The oval saloon and the blue room have been used forever for receptions. So what happens is, the reason why it's an oval is President Washington loved an oval room in his presidential house in Philadelphia. And if you haven't watched my videos on pre-Whitehouse presidential residences, you should. There's a link up there, and I'll put it in the description. There was an oval room in President's house in Philadelphia, and Washington enjoyed it greatly because he was able to stand by the fireplace and people could come and greet him from one side, and then the line would finish on the other side. So it facilitated greeting a lot of people. Washington was very particular about these levees or receptions, and so part of what he would do is he would put his one hand on his sword and one hand holding his hat to encourage people to bow. He would bow to them too. It wasn't a self-aggrandizing type of thing. He just wasn't one for physical contact. So he loved the oval room because it facilitated these lines of people greeting the president, and it also allowed him to stay near the fireplace while these people were milling around waiting in line. So anyway, this is basically the same as the Pierce scheme. And then here we get to the first photograph where, again, it's essentially the same, but it now has these geometric segmented wall coverings, courtesy of Andrew Johnson's niece. There's also a new gasolier, you can see. That's courtesy of Grant, who added a lot of gasoliers, even though gasification was roughly 1858. There is a carpet that was also added by Grant. It sort of harkens back to that carpet we saw in the green room. You'll remember it had that same sort of outline and sparse decoration in the same color as the rest of the room. And then the part that's really interesting for me is this Rococo Revival circular divan, or settee. It was a 19-piece set made by Gottlieb Vollmer of Philadelphia, made of gilded ash and blue brocatelle silk. Brocatelle is a type of silk where the pattern is raised somewhat. Brocade, if you'll remember, is a type of fabric where it's woven in such a way that the pattern actually jumps out at you. It's an actual texture. So there's the original fabric, and then what's woven in is physically raised above the level of the fabric. So brocatelle is not quite that much. It's just in a similar vein of that sort of thing. It was bought by Harriet Lane, who was James Buchanan's hostess since he was a bachelor in 1860. So this was replacing an earlier set that we'll see later. But this is just like the Green Room, where the Rococo Revival movement is slowly making its face known in the White House in various rooms. It stayed until 1902, so they did get roughly 40 years of use out of it, which is when Roosevelt got rid of it, and it's now in storage. And I found out it's recently been reupholstered in the original color, which is quite beautiful. You can see that's a picture of it on the right. And then this scheme did not last long. Here's another picture where you can see just how jumbly it was with some more of that furniture. You can see there are couches and armchairs and footstools. Here is President Grant greeting King Kalakaua of the Hawaiian Islands during his state visit in 1874. By the way, if you haven't watched my video on this topic, on the state dinners and the history of state dinners, you should go watch it. I'll put a link in the description and up above right now. And it was a fabulous visit where not only the first state dinner was held, but also great celebrations were made. Millions of dollars were spent in order to entertain this king of Hawaii. And so the newspapers, who were fascinated by royalty as they are today, they made this illustration of the king and Grant with their representatives standing in the blue room. And you can see that the upholstery is sort of brocatelle in that the pattern does jump out at you. If you look on the left, it sort of reminds me of what the wallpaper was during the Pierce years. So then what happens is various presidents use the room and nothing happens. Here's Rutherford B. Hayes greeting the first Chinese minister to America, which is fascinating. This room has also become useful in that it's perfect for presidents receiving ambassadorial credentials. So the president will often receive ambassadors, newly minted ambassadors here, in order for them to present their credentials, as we just said. So anyway, the decoration hasn't changed at all so far. And then Chester Arthur comes along. Chester Arthur, as you'll remember, takes great pains to completely refurbish the White House. We talked about how he went on this militant campaign and would inspect the White House every evening. He would come from where he was living in Washington, D.C. I believe he was living in the house of a very wealthy senator. He would come over in the evenings after dinner and would inspect every inch of the White House to make sure that the work was going on well. And it produced this. This is a colorized picture from Nest magazine, which I don't think exists anymore, but they did a wonderful job. I had to fix the colors a bit to make it accurate, but it basically shows you what he did. The furniture is the same, although here it looks like a dark blue velour type of thing, similar to the wall hangings we saw in the Roosevelt redecoration of the Green Room. And then there's a new carpet, which is kind of interesting, blue and yellow, which matches the gilding on the furniture and the mirror. And then there's the mirror frames, and the mirror frames are the same. I'm just saying it matches the gilding. And then there are these sconces, which are these sort of candelabra that just jut out from the wall. And then there is the obvious wall coverings, which are just beautiful in my opinion, very wonderful. And the fact that it's a circular motif, I think, matches the semicircular nature of the blue room well. The ceiling has, it's basically made of certain types of paper, so they would use like silk paper and silver paper, things like that, in order to make some parts shiny and some parts not. Here you can see the picture not colorized, but with more pixels, so you get a better image of what was going on there. And it doesn't completely change the blue room, but it at least gives it an interesting feel. I kind of like the ceiling. I think it's interesting. It was described as robin's egg blue. And once again, there are no paintings. It's all architectural or wallpaper details. And then here you can see the room decorated for Grover Cleveland's wedding. So Grover Cleveland is the only president to have actually been married in office, as far as I know. And Grover Cleveland got married to Frances Folsom, who I believe was his niece through his through one of his relatives. It's very strange. She was a lot younger than him. But it was a very large wedding. And this is, as you can see, we're getting into the late 19th century. So this was, the 1880s. And suddenly the plants are cropping up again. And they've taken over the mirror frame. There's some palms. But these are obviously part of the wedding decorations. So they were temporary. It just gives you another view. And then here are two wonderful colorized things you can see. On the left is a half of a stereo card that was colorized, showing you the other side of the room with the windows. So they've got those same pierced curtains. And then on the right is from that same guidebook that where I showed you that portrait of Lucy Webb Hayes. And so it gives you a much better clue into what the room looked like, at the hands of someone who's drawing as opposed to colorizing a photograph. And as with all schemes in the 19th century, at least in the White House, it doesn't last for long, and so Benjamin Harrison turns it into this. So he's left the Buchanan furniture and the pierced mirrors and the Grant Gasolier, but he's added he's had the furniture reupholstered. So I guess that upholstery lasted roughly 30 years. And in this terrible, talk about Brocatelle, fabric that from a distance looks like leopard print, but on a diseased leopard. I don't even... it's a leopard print with a melanin disorder, excuse me. It's just, I don't even know how to describe how ugly it is. It's terrible. But the things that are of most interest to us are the fact that he left the pierced mirrors and the Grant Gasolier, and then you can see the walls now have this plain silk, and then above there are these sconces which have electric lights on them. Here's another view where you can see some people milling around the room, probably as disgusted by the furniture as I am, except for that one lady who seems to be taking a breath while sitting on it, and which also gives you a view of the ceiling, which has changed slightly. The Harrisons always loved circular ceilings. You remember, we look back to that entrance hall, everything was circles. I think I'm starting to notice a pattern here, don't you? Don't you think there's a pattern? And then you can see that this scheme also has the Hannibal clock on the mantle over there. And then it also kind of evolves a little bit when McKinley comes into office. Remember, he's not in office for long, so he does get some of his way. It's been refurbished now to a colonial revival and neo-Georgian style. This is 1899, with plasterwork that's a holdover from the Benjamin Harrison administration, as you can see. The curtains and entablatures are new, which is quite interesting. There's restored silk on the furniture. Finally, someone has some interesting sense. And then there's this new mirror with these two colonnettes, which is quite nice. Here you can see a very, very, very high pixel count image. And you can see that not only are we able to get a good view of the silk on the furniture and the fireplace and the overmantel mirror, but we also get to see that Minerva clock, which we saw in the entrance room. Do you remember? The one that was made by Thomier and Louis Monet? That's the same one. Here it just is unfortunate that the gilding has turned up black. And then there is this Sèvres vase. Here you can look at this colorized stereograph where the gilding looks too much, and then they've decided to forget that the fireplace mantle was painted white and decide to make it look like natural wood. So anyway, if you look on the right, you can see that there's this blue Sèvres vase. Here you can see it. It's just the color and the lighting. It's one of my favorites. It's beautiful. I have too many favorites, don't I? This cobalt blue Sèvres vase is in the form of an amphora. Again, we're calling back to ancient Greek pottery. Can they come up with anything new? I don't know. Incidentally, do you know what the difference between a vase and a vase is? Anyone? $35. It was given to McKinley in 1898 by the President of France to celebrate the Franco-American cable beneath the Atlantic. The Franco-American cable that literally sat beneath the Atlantic Ocean, the first telegram that went on it, on this type of cable, was from Queen Victoria to James Buchanan, which was a letter of congratulations. And as I said, the first one of these cables was promptly destroyed by a guy who thought more electricity equaled faster messaging. And so only 1 month after it was built, he destroyed it. He then tried to argue that the production of the cable was the problem, very sly, which obviously didn't work. And so there were succeeding cables, and this is just one of them, which, as I said, produced this beautiful vase, of which there are two. And then in this other stereograph, you can see that there's a piano, which also has a blue silk covering. I wonder if it's the one from before in the green room. The leg is different, but the covering seems the same, so it might suggest that these coverings were made at the same time, or that the old one deteriorated and that this one was made to replace the old one when the piano was relocated here. Whoever colorized this obviously took some artistic license with the colorization. I don't think the mantle wasn't all gilded, and I don't think that the plasterwork was painted yellow, but either way, it's sort of interesting. And so this McKinley decoration, here you can see that piano again with a little palm sitting on the... What does a palm mean? What does a palm mean? We need a quiz. What does a palm mean? A palm means change, right? It means that something is going to happen. And so just like in the East Room where there was one palm sitting on top of that one piece of furniture, this one palm is going to be our sign. And as funny or not as that may be, it is a good sign that something is coming, because who comes after McKinley? Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt becomes president upon the assassination of McKinley and decides to make it like this. Oh, yet another suspenseful cutoff. Well, sometimes that's how the presidential cookie crumbles, my friends. I guess you just have to wait until next time to see the incredibly radical changes that Roosevelt brought to the Blue Room and the rest of the White House. Do join us to see the rest of the White House in the following two programs, here on Presidential History.